Okay, so with that said, thanks again, everybody, for coming. This is the third annual Missing Middle Summit. Again, I think there are many people here who've been here before, but some of you have not. So for the sake of kind of recapping why we're here, what we're talking about, I'm gonna just chat a little bit. And if we could get presentation 2 up on the screen, I'll start off with that. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so the missing middle and why it matters. Here we go. So the housing crisis is real. Ultimately, what we're talking about is building housing in a city that desperately needs more housing. Here are some stats to make this kind of like stand out. So the home price to income ratio, which is really the measure of affordability, it's not just what our price is, but what our price is relative incomes. The home price to income ratio in the GTA is now 11x. And by contrast, in the 1990s, it was 4x. CMHC did a study that showed that Canada needs an additional 3.5 million homes, more than we would typically build, so these are incremental homes, by 2030 to restore 1990s era affordability. We build about 250,000 per year. So if you do the math, we only have 5 years left. We're not even close to getting there. Condominium pre-sales, I think there are a few agents in the room you might know have kind of fallen off the cliff over the last year. They were down over 50% last year. They're down even more this year, which is to say that source of supply is completely drying up. If you project this forward to 27, 28, 29, there's gonna be much less housing hitting the market than there is this year. And in Ontario alone is short 1.85 million homes by 2030. The provincial government set this target for 1.5 million homes by 2030. This was set, I think, 4 years ago. You might also know that we're nowhere near hitting that target, and actually the need for housing has increased given our immigration levels. Next slide, please. So what is the missing middle? So the missing middle refers to housing that is more dense than a detached house and less dense than, let's say, a tall mid-rise. There's some debate as to what the upper limit of missing middle housing is. But generally what we're talking about are duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. We're talking about townhouses, stacked townhouses, and 3 to 6 story apartment buildings. And we're gonna talk about all those types of housing today. This is the sort of housing that cities pre-modern zoning would naturally build as the cities got more attractive, brought more people in, and just incrementally got more dense. It's very unnatural, actually, historically, to have a city where you have mostly 1, 2 story detached and semi-detached houses, and in small pockets with really tall high rises, and then now, let's say, some mid-rises on avenues. That is like 100% a function of regulation. It's not how cities historically have grown. It's not how cities are intended to grow. And this middle scale, this middle typology of housing has become missing. So this is what we're talking about. And really what we're trying to do here is kind of encourage developers, policymakers, advocates, and even the community to allow for more of these building types, to build more of these building types so that, at some point we could drop the missing from the missing middle name. Gentle density, we're talking about intensification that is not too out of scale with what is typically built in a neighborhood. So it would fit on a typical 25 to 50 foot wide Toronto lot. And it's often built by small developers and homeowners, not often by large institutions. So there was a time that the distinction between builder and developer was not that great. People who were developers were people who knew how to build things. Now to be a developer, you need to be, like an urban planner or a municipal lawyer or something like that, because most of what you do actually is navigate the entitlement and approval process. And builders are now construction managers. It's kind of like a subdiscipline. What's interesting about missing middle housing is that it is a scale that is approachable for people who want to try their first thing in development. So often we'll see people who are general contractors, people who are architects, who want to do a little bit more than kind of like the service work and pick up their first site and build a multiplex. And I think it's very encouraging both for what it delivers to the city in terms of housing, but also what it delivers to the industry. It's kind of like a more varied group of people who could kind of like put their stamp on the urban fabric. So this is a big part of why we like missing middle housing. Why supply matters. Prices, we learned this all in economics class. Prices are a function of supply and demand. There's been a lot of action taken policy-wise on the demand side. So we've had interest rates that are much higher today than they were 5 years ago. We have immigration levels that are now lower than they were over the past few years. There have been other things like vacant home taxes, limits on Airbnb. All this action that's been taken on demand. We're starting to see some action on the supply side, but not nearly enough. And one indication of that is our prices are still quite high. Rents are still quite high, prices are still quite high. We're still in this housing crisis. The more units we build, all else equal, the lower the rents will be. And this ultimately allows for better labor mobility and productivity. So people who live in parts of the country that have fewer jobs are able to move to parts of the country that have more jobs. This is how kind of economies typically sort themselves out. And this modern zoning is a big obstacle to that labor mobility, and it's something that we need to do something about. Missing Middle delivers units on scattered infill sites fast and cheap. So it is cheaper on a per square foot basis to build a multiplex, a stick frame multiplex, than like a poured in place concrete mid-rise or high-rise building. And if we want housing to be more affordable, the inputs into the construction of housing are very important. The housing theory of everything. So this is more like a recommendation for you guys to do maybe on your time. There's an essay called The Housing Theory of Everything, and I recommend that you all read it. Its core claim is that housing scarcity is the root cause of many social ills: inequality, productivity slump, climate change, obesity, and falling fertility. So whereas we might think we're just building housing because it makes for a good business and we like to design or we like to build, building more housing is actually how we solve many societal ills, and this article really goes into it. These are the 5 knock-on effects that are highlighted in the article. So inequality and wealth. When you constrict the supply of new housing, homeowners gain. There's less competition. There are more people looking to buy housing than there are people looking to sell housing. Homeowners gain, as they have in Toronto, certainly over the last 10 years, and renters lose as rents increase. And the inequality, the wealth inequality between older homeowners and often younger renters has just grown dramatically over the last 10 years, and our lack of housing supply is a big contributing factor. Economic productivity, again, as economies shift, typically what you want to see happen is people moving from parts of the country where there are fewer jobs to parts of the country where there are more jobs. And that is just happening less than it has before because, in Toronto, for example, our housing is just too expensive. We have the highest wages in the country in Toronto, but housing is still so expensive that it often makes much more sense to live outside of Toronto. The environment, the more we constrain housing supply, infill, multi-unit, intensification within neighborhoods, the more we push the demand into urban sprawl. More urban sprawl, longer commutes, higher emissions. This is not great. There's another fun stat that I read in a book called Scale that showed that a city of 10 million people consumes 15% less energy in aggregate than 2 cities of 5 million people each. There are economies of scale. More people live closer to where they work. They walk, they cycle, they take transit. Multi-unit housing often shares walls with other units, so there's less need for insulation, there's less energy leak. So there are very good environmental reasons, even setting aside, Toronto Green Standards and stuff like that. Just the act of building infill, missing middle housing is a positive environmental good. Health and obesity, our lifestyles have become extremely car dependent as we've kind of sprawled out further and further away from our places of work. We like the idea of walkable neighborhoods, of nice, dense, walkable neighborhoods, and of course, that's a much healthier lifestyle. And in demographics, a lot of people, of course, are pushing off the idea of getting married or having kids. This family formation is getting further and further pushed out as housing affordability gets worse. And I think this is an under-discussed problem that relates to the housing crisis, but it's a very big one. This is one of the most important thing in many people's lives, and we're just making it much harder for people to start that journey. Missing middle housing solves for the housing theory of everything. So greater affordability means you have more disposable income, greater labor mobility and economies of agglomeration, greater land use efficiency and shorter commutes, greater walkability, greater affordability, and more space to plan and build a future. So these are all the things that we're accomplishing together as we build more infill missing middle housing. There are some barriers in Toronto. Some of them are falling. I'm going to highlight these very quickly. The rest of the day will be experts, domain experts talking about these in much more detail. But at a high level, we started this event I mentioned 2 years ago. We started it 1 week after the multiplex bylaw was passed, and we're going to hear a lot about the multiplex bylaw. This was a major change, a major positive change in Toronto planning that allowed for more multi-unit housing on any residential lot in Toronto. Many people will argue, I think most people in this room will argue, that it's still too restrictive. The buildings are too short and have too few units to get to a pro forma with a residual land basis that allows you to buy a typical Toronto lot and redevelop it as a multiplex. And for that reason, we're going to see some stats on actually how few multiplexes have been built since the passage of the multiplex bylaw. The major streets policy. So last year, it was on the same day as I think the council vote on the multiplex bylaw, and Brad was kind enough to come give a speech and run back to vote on that. The major streets policy, again, a very positive, major positive change in Toronto land use planning that allows for apartment buildings, 6-story apartment buildings on all of our major streets. In many ways, it's still too prescriptive. There's a unit cap. 60 is better than 30. There shouldn't be a unit cap. Whether you have a 40-foot wide lot or a 400-foot wide lot means you probably want to design your building a little differently, and one might require more units than the other. You have these large setback requirements, which we're going to hear a lot about from Nama Blonder. These amenity space requirements, which should add to the cost of construction and take away leasable area and also ultimately make it harder for pro formas to pencil. So these are all positive steps. These are all barriers that are falling, but they have to fall further if we don't want to end up here 10 years from now looking back and wondering why so few of these got built. Development charges are still far too high. We're starting to hear a little bit more political will at the federal, provincial, and even municipal level to reduce those. So we'll see what happens. And ultimately, I think that Toronto has not yet decided whether or not it wants to be a real city. We only really hit our growth spur over the last 20 years. And a lot of people remember what it was like before then. And it was nice and it was quiet. And there wasn't a lot of competition for parking spots on streets, and there weren't many shadows. And some people like that, and I think that's fine. But we have a lot of people who've moved to the city since then. We have a lot of young people, we have a lot of immigrants who moved to the city, and I think it's incumbent on us to build a city that could accommodate all of these people. Ultimately, I think it's a more interesting, dynamic place. That might be an aesthetic preference, but I think we probably share that if we're in this room. Call to action. Okay, so these are my calls to action for everybody in the room. So developers, you can be the builder operator. Many people in the room have or are currently building missing middle housing. Many of you are thinking about it. I think the purpose of this conference is to get you caught up to speed on a lot of the considerations that you might need to make to get onto that journey. There's probably at least one person in the room for every kind of category that you need to talk to, and we're gonna have a lot of time for mingling between our talks. Start small, scale fast. We're gonna have talks on building a development business. Policymakers and advocates, keep clearing regulations, fund infrastructure. If housing is a priority, which everybody says it is, we need the action to kind of like follow that rhetoric. And then a community. Missing middle housing enriches streets, schools, and shops. Support it. Ultimately, the reason why we have these restrictive land use rules are because they're very popular. A lot of people actually don't want multiplexes in their neighborhoods. That attitude is starting to change, and we're starting to see it change at the policy level and at the community level, but I think we need to push a little bit further still. And this is ultimately about being more welcoming rather than more restrictive in our neighborhoods.